Let's talk about the Podcasting 2.0 features that Transistor offers, at least in early February 2023. I'm on the podcastindex.org/apps page. If you've not seen this page before, chances are you have if you're looking for Podcasting 2.0 stuff. But if you haven't, you can find a directory of all of the apps hosting websites and other directories that support Podcasting 2.0 and filter down for the specific features that they offer. You can see here Transistor offers chapters, funding, locked, OP3, person, podping, transcript, and the TXT field in Podcasting 2.0. If this is your first time talking about or hearing about Podcasting 2.0, they're really pushing the boundaries of what RSS podcasts can deliver, not only for hosting companies, but for the podcast creators themselves and the podcast listeners and the entire industry at large. I'm going to skip PodPing for this one because it's not an end user feature that you can really get your hands on. It is a very cool feature that allows directories like the Podcast Index, and wouldn't it be great if Spotify and Apple supported this, in order to get updates of new shows almost instantaneously, maybe within seconds, maybe even faster. I forget how fast it is, but it's a lot faster and a lot more less resource intensive than just crawling an RSS feed, scooping up the data, and doing that again across millions of podcasts. PodPings allows hosting companies to notify other directories that, hey, there's been an update to, let's say, Matt's podcast. Go check it out. It happens faster and more efficiently than the old ways of crawling RSS feeds. Okay, so it's also good to know that Transistor supports chapters and the chapters functionality. The funding functionality, let's take a look at that really quick. That's not value for value. In other words, that's not the sort of Lightning Network and paying for podcasts or boosting podcasts and streaming podcast payments through Satoshis. This is very much just the funding tag. So let's just take a look at the settings on where to do that. So let's just take a look at the funding tag inside Transistor. This is not to be confused with the value tag, which allows you to send boostograms, accept payments and donations, and again, boostograms through the Lightning Network. The funding tag is simply this tag, which is labeled Patreon and donations inside of your social settings, inside your Transistor podcast settings panel. Right here, you can put any link that sends to a payment, or literally you can put anything, right? If you have a Shopify store, if you have a membership site, if you have a lemon squeezy site or whatever, buy me a coffee, you can put that link in here. And for any app that supports displaying the funding tag, it'll show up in that podcast app. Now, again, these things aren't widely adopted. Podcasting 2.0 sadly isn't being, scooped up by the entire industry, although more innovations, more changes, more awareness will help that. But if you had something like recommending Overcast or Fountain or Podverse, if you're recommending the new podcast apps, which again, you can go and take a look at podcastindex.org/apps. If you're recommending those types of Podcasting 2.0 apps to your listeners, the more awareness, the better it is for you, me, and the rest of the podcast industry. So that's the funding tag. You can put any payment tag in there so that you can get paid or get donations. Let's go back to Transistor. There's the locked tag, which by default podcasts are locked so that people can't just scoop up your podcast and then send it out to some other, either podcast directory or download all of your podcasts to another podcast host. You do have to unlock the podcast before it is transferred. That's not right. Next up, we'll talk about the locked tag. This does exactly what it sounds like. It locks this podcast to prevent it from being imported into another podcast hosting platform. It's a great way to protect yourself from somebody just stealing all your content and putting it up on Apple, Spotify, Google, or somewhere else, because they're not really checking for that stuff. Aside from the locked tag, of course. If it's locked, it won't be able to be imported. Transistor won't transfer it out, which is great, as long as the other directory is respecting the lock tag, which many of them do these days. So that's a great way to sort of help protect yourself from getting your show either pirated or migrated to some other directory to duplicate the content. We'll skip PodPing. I already talked about that. Soundbite. Oops. Next up is OP3. Again, this one is very, very cutting edge. If we go down into the settings here, you'll see that you can enable open podcast prefix analytics. And what this is almost like donating your analytics to an open source project to help the overall industry with giving us better stats, more transparent stats that aren't behind some kind of paywall or closed curtain that we don't really know how valid the metrics are. So again, this is something that it's almost like saying, yes, I'll donate my, and I'll even just enable it now, I'll donate my analytics to the OP3 project. And there'll be other enhancements to the OP3 project soon where you can actually see stats and get the analytics of your podcast that go beyond what Transistor might be tracking. But it's certainly a cutting edge, bleeding edge analytics. I don't even want to call it an analytics service because it's really just one or two folks who are really supporting this project now, but we hope that this will enhance over time. The more that folks contribute to it, the better it'll get. Next up is the person tag. This is really cool. If we go to the people section, and arguably, let me just save this first. Arguably, this is something I have not set up on this particular podcast, but if I add my first person, it's almost like a social bio, but for your podcast. And I can pull in data from my Twitter account, fill out my name, who am I in the grand scheme of things? Am I the host, just a guest? Adding these people tags will allow the Podcasting 2.0 apps that support it to display that information. So you can see who my guests are and get quick bio information by, like the account bio information that I filled out here inside podcasting apps. Again, a lot of the stuff, the industry has to play catch up. Like you need to have apps that support this stuff so that you can take full advantage of it. But it's really cool because if I have a guest, you can click their name right in the podcast app and see all of the available information that has been filled out, about that person. Social media, of course, a little bio, a photo. It just helps extend the podcast as a resource or these tags as a resource to listeners. It just enhances the overall listening experience by getting access to some extended information in a nice, neat way, which is right inside the podcast app. We're going to skip transcript for a second and just talk about the TXT field. This is a new field that in the podcasting 2.0 world that allows a host to validate a podcast. It gives the podcast host and the podcast owner another way to validate their podcast. Like in the event that somebody is trying to migrate, you can fill out a verification code. We're going to skip transcript for a moment and just talk about the TXT field. This is a new to Podcasting 2.0 field, again, early 2023, that allows hosts and podcast owners to have a verification code inside this text field that would be just another layer of security and defense from migrating a podcast. It's another way to prove ownership. It's another way to say, hey, you can't take this audio without being able to verify this. I think of it as almost like two-factor authentication to a degree, but it's just another way to help protect and secure our podcasts. Saving the best for last is transcripts. This is a big one. If we go into our episodes, click into an episode, and then go down to the transcript section here, I can upload SRT, VTT, or text files, or I can simply copy and paste my transcripts right into this text box. And Podcasting 2.0, when you have apps that support the transcript tag, those transcripts will show right inside of the app, which again acts as another great resource for listeners, and just another way for not just accessibility, but for usability of your podcast. People want to skim through, especially if it's a long podcast, or like a resource podcast, like my Fall River podcast is. It's just taking local city government meetings and publishing it out on audio. People can go through and skim for the details that they really want to find at the moments that they want to listen to, and then tune into just those moments. So transcripts is still very early days. I mean, the tag has been available for a while. There's a lot of Podcasting 2.0 apps that do support it. Now the flip side is getting more creators and podcasters to include that with their show, right, with their podcast. And one thing that I wish Transistor did is have a auto transcript feature inside of the accounts. I use Descript to transcribe this stuff, but it would be great if Transistor, even if it was a paid add-on, transcribe podcast episodes for us, and then I could just turn it on with a flick of a switch. That means that I wouldn't have to take those extra steps to copy and paste the transcript into my publishing workflow. So that's it for the Podcasting 2.0 features at So that's it for all the Podcasting 2.0 features at Transistor. Again, here we are, early February 2023. I suspect and expect that there'll be more Podcasting 2.0 support coming soon. Hopefully the value tag, so that people can start getting lightning payments, boostograms, streaming payments right inside of these Podcasting 2.0 apps that support it. I know it's pretty technical. I know it pushes the boundaries, and sometimes people aren't really interested in something that works with Bitcoin, but it is sort of the future of payments, at least as of right now. The typical Stripes and payment processors of the world, they don't support this, and they probably won't support this without taking a huge chunk of revenue from us, whereas the value tag is very flexible with that, especially using the Bitcoin and Lightning Network technology. So there it is. Hope you enjoyed today's video. If you like what you saw in today's video and you want to sign up with Transistor or test it out in the 14-day free trial, go ahead and use the link in the description. If you end up signing up, it helps me earn a little bit, enough to buy a cup of coffee to help support the channel and to help support the podcast setup at thepodcastsetup.com. It's a weekly newsletter for podcasters to discover other podcasters and check out their podcast setup, what microphones they're using, what software they're using, and to learn a little bit more about them as a podcaster, why they started their podcast. You too can sign up and get interviewed for free. Go to the podcast setup and check out the links there. It's free promotion. It's a great way to learn and discover from other podcasters, but to also get your podcast in front of a new audience. Check it out. Free newsletter every week, thepodcastsetup.com.